Hi everyone. Today I'm going to talk about how to form HA in C9800-CL environment, or how to form HA with virtual C9800 controller. So before proceeding for actual steps, or before I explain about how to form HA or what commands are used for forming HA for C9800-CL, I would really recommend to go through the latest or the relevant version which you are going to deploy to form HA on C9800-CL. So I'm going to do this, or I'm going to show the demo on 17.3.5a. So I'm referring 17.3.x version. So if you see here, this is my configuration guide of 17.3.x, and if I go to this particular section, which is configuring high availability. Now there are two different parts, especially when C9800-CL with 16.x came up. We had no RMI feature, or we had no option to configure RMI, Redundancy Management Interface, which is used to track your gateway reachability. So not only your physical interface, which is connected like back to back in between two controllers, but you have even the gateway reachability check through your RMI interface, which is your logical interface, not the physical interface to form HA, right? So I'm going to refer configuring redundancy management interface section. Okay, now if you see in this section, there are only two commands which are required to form HA. First is about which interface will be used into C9800 to form HA, or which is the HA interface which you're going to configure on the controller. So according to C9800 guide, you need to configure gig3 as a dedicated interface. And if you even refer the data sheet, let me show you data sheet. This is your network interface mapping. And if you see here, Cisco has given clear details about how many interfaces are required if in case you want to configure HA. So gig 1 is used for your out of band management interface. So if you have out of band management infrastructure, you can actually connect this gig 1 to your out of band management infra. Gig 2 is your wireless management interface, where your APs and client will be able to connect to or will register to. So you would have gig 2 normally configured as a trunk port, where you will allow AP VLAN as well as client VLANs. Gig 3 is your high availability interface. What I mean is, this is the interface which is dedicated as RP port to connect back to your controllers. So if you have two different ESXi servers running on two different chassis or two different physical server, you will make sure that you have a layer 2 connectivity to map a gig 3 and allow a communication as a layer 2 communication between these two virtual controllers. But in case of having a one ESXi server, you would actually configure a gig 3 and map to one of the VNIC or virtual NIC and allow that particular VLAN or layer 2 VLAN to have a communication between two controllers. Alright, so this is the best practice, or this is what Cisco recommends, that you have a dedicated interfaces for a different purpose. Alright, so first is your data sheet, which talks about, not data sheet, the cloud deployment guide, which you need to refer, and you need to go through this particular network interface mapping section. And then based on that, you need to deploy C9800-CL in your environment. Then you need to refer the configuration guide for your version, which you are going to deploy on. And then you need to, refer the section which is relevant to HA. All right. And also I would recommend, because I have come across many customers, they have got some some queries related to HA configuration. They have certain queries talking about, can I configure internal DHCP server? What is the maximum limit of client IP address binding and all those stuff. So this is really a very good guide where you will have all the details mentioned, and I would really request everyone, before deploying C9800, I think you need to refer once this best practice guide, and you will definitely get clarity in terms of how you're going to deploy C9800 in your environment. Okay. Scenarios for deploying C9800-CL in HA form, and you got left side one single V switch on one ESXi box, but you have different port groups configured, and on your right side you got two different V switches, and you have actually separated your rest of the VMs on one of the V switch and your C9800 in dedicated V switch. On your left, normally a customer has got multiple VMs running on ESXi server on a single V switch. You can basically create a port group, map to the NIC, and then that respected port group where you are going to map C9800 controller, you can allow promiscuous mode and force transmit as accept. That way you can isolate your MAC learning from, in between port groups, even though it is in a single V switch. On your right side, you can see you have actually got two different logical switches. So you can do the same thing, and you can isolate, C9800 controller environment from rest of the VMs. Same thing, it's quite different here. You got a physical interface. It's like, you have separated your infrastructure physically by having, vSwitch map to different physical uplink switches. That way you can again separate your MAC learning capability on your physical uplink switches. In my lab, what I've done is I got three different dedicated virtual switches in one in ESXi server. So the one vSwitch, which is vSwitch 0, mapped to out of band management, and that's on VLAN 1. Another vSwitch is for only trunk configuration or the wireless management interface, mapped to gig 2. vSwitch 0, which is mapped to gig 1. OOB switch, which is mapped to gig 2, and a new RP switch mapped to gig 3. So I've got three different switches in my lab. I can show you in the lab, and that's how my setup is. And as I told you, only two commands are required if you want to configure C9800-CL with HA. First is to designate or map to gig 3, map gig 3 as HA interface. And second command is redundant management interface and the VLAN which you configured for wireless management. Pick two IP address, map one on chassis 1 and second one on chassis 2. So that's the second command. Shared redundant management command from my lab. So I picked two IP addresses from management interface, wireless management interface. One is one IP is given to chassis 1, other one is for chassis 2. If you want to break HA, you can break HA with no redundant management command. And if you want to enable console on standby, you just need to enable or configure standby console enable command on your active controller. So that's about presentation now. Let's go back to actual demo. So I got two virtual controller console access. On my left, I got the active one, which I want to make the left controller as active and the right controller as standby. And you can see on my left controller, I got IP addressing configured. So gig is my out of band management, gig 2 is my trunk, which is wireless management, and gig 3 is my actually a redundant port. So I'm going to map that to RP. And if you see my VLAN, I have actually configured VLAN 9, which will be configured under gig 3, and that will be used for layer 2 communication between two controllers. So let me quickly configure that. Show gig interface gig 3, switch port mode access, switch port access VLAN 9, no shut. So that's the configuration of RP port. Now if I see my IP route, I have already configured IP route here. So IP routing is okay. Now everything looks fine on left side controller session perspective. My SVI is configured for wireless management. I have configured gig 1. I configured gig 3 as well. And if I give showroom var, that talks about my chassis number is 1. So I haven't configured anything about redundancy management or redundancy commands, and it is just showing my chassis number. Now let me come back to right side session controller, and if you see here, I don't have anything. So let me configure out of band management. So before that, let me show you my interface mapping. Okay, so let's say this is my left side session controller which I was showing you. You can see here I got a VM network, new trunk and RP. These are the port groups mapped to network adapters. So network adapter 1 is gig 1, network adapter 2 is gig 2, network adapter 3 is gig 3. So dedicated port, which is gig 3, which is network adapter 3, is mapped to C9800-RP, which is a redundant port. I have just given name to my port group. Now where these port groups are mapped, right? So under the networking, if you see C9800-RP is mapped to VLAN 9 here, yeah, and it is part of my vSwitch new RP switch. Same thing goes with new trunk. It's mapped to trunk VLAN. I mean, if you configure 4095, it's nothing but trunk in ESXi. Then you got my default vSwitch or port group. It's actually for out of band management. So that's how I have mapped my port groups here. So now if you see gig 1 is my out of band management. So let me pick the IP address from the out of band management subnet, show run gig 1. So I'll configure here no switch port, IP address 192.168.0.125/24. That's my gig 1 out of band management, and gig 2 is my my trunk port, right? So switch port mode trunk, switch port trunk allowed VLAN 20, 21, 30, 40 and 31. No shut. And if I see now the only interface which is dedicated for my RP port, which is gig 3, now I'm going to configure that as access, switch port access VLAN 9, no shut. So my interface configuration is done on the right side. If I see now, I've got out of band management IP address configured, and I'll pick the same IP address, IP address from same pool. This is my wireless management interface VLAN 40, IP address 192.168.40.125. So that's my SVI, and now I need to configure reachability, routing. So config T IP route 192.168.0.0 to 55.0 192.168.0.1. You can have a default route if everything goes through single gateway, but I'm actually dedicating out of band management as a different subnet, and my wireless management different, so I'm putting a static route. So this is for out of band management, and second is about my AP subnet 192.168.40.1, and then clients, so 10.20.20.0. Then I got 30. Then I got Active Directory or shared services configured under 192.168.20.0, and that's it. So IP routing is done. Interfaces are configured. If I try to ping my gateway for wireless management, I'm able to reach. So all looks fine. Now if I give showroom var, I haven't configured redundancy management. Same thing goes here as I was already showing you here. So let me configure now actual two commands which are required to form HA, right? First is to just map a gig3 for HA interface. So the command is chassis redundancy HA interface gig3. Yes. And the second command is redundant management interface VLAN, which is my 40 VLAN for wireless management chassis 1. Sorry, before that let me see my chassis. Okay, chassis 1, this is chassis 2, and the priority is same. So I want to make this as active. Okay, so I'm going to configure priority 2, show chassis. So priority 2 is done. Now I can configure redundant management interface VLAN 40 chassis 1 address 192.168.40.126. Sorry, not subnet mask. I think it's chassis 2 address 192.168.40.127. So 127 is my right side WLC session, and 126 is the current where I'm doing configuration. So redundancy management is done, and I need to configure same thing here. Chassis redundancy HA interface gig 3, yes. Then redundancy management interface VLAN 40 chassis 1 address 192.168.40.126 chassis 2 address 192.168.40.127. So all good. So I configured both the commands on both the sessions or both the controllers. Now if I give showroom var, I could see my chassis 2 is configured gig3 as my HA interface, and the local IP is 127 and remote IP is 126. How about this one? Showroom var, my chassis number is 1, gig3, my local IP is 126 and the remote IP is 127. So all looks fine. Now I'm going to reboot both the controllers. Okay, so reload, yes. So it's reloading now. Yep, and I'll reload this as well. Yes. Okay, it got reloaded. Now I'm going to pause this video for some time, and once it comes back, we'll go through the logs or the console session messages and then understand how it is formed. Yeah, looks like both the controllers are back, and we could see that on your right the controller session is showing its standby. On your left the controller session is showing it's active. Let's verify. I should not able to get enable prompt or config prompt on the right side controller session. However, on the left, yes, I should able to see. Yes, show redundancy states. You can see here the my state shows active, the PS state shows standby, right? And redundancy mode is SSO showroom var. It shows the same. My switch chassis number is 1, and if I give show chassis RMI, as you can see chassis number 1 is highlighted as active with the priority 2. Okay, so looks fine from redundancy perspective. You can see here my redundancy mode is active, sorry, SSO, and the current software state is active, and the standby location slot 2 is standby hot. Okay, so all looks fine. Now if I want to enable the config prompt on the standby, I need to execute couple of commands. So I'll go to redundancy mode, main CPU, and then standby console CLI. Standby console enable, sorry. Okay, so it's done. Give some time, it should sync, and then we should able to log in into the standby as well. So let me see. Yes, I'm getting prompt for password. Yes, I'm able to log in. Now if I give show chassis RMI, you can see its asterisk is been shown on chassis 2 because it's a local chassis, and it is showing standby as a rule. And show redundancy states, it's showing me the my state is standby hot and peer state is active. So all looks fine. Now let me log in into GUI and try to see on GUI what's the redundancy status. Yeah, so I'm into GUI now, and let me see the redundancy states. So dashboard has got an option to see that. Here it is showing me active chassis, CPU and memory graph, and this is my standby chassis graph. If I want to monitor redundancy details under the monitoring, I should able to see chassis details here. So yeah, as you can see, chassis 1 is active, IP addressing, MAC address, image version. So all looks fine. I hope you are good with configuring C9800-CL with HA.